Okay, art historians, welcome to our second part of realism, where we're going to start looking at realism just for a brief second over in the Americas. But we're really not going to focus on realism in North America. Instead, we're going to focus on realism more in Mexico, so Mesoamerican area. So actually, there were some really big things that had just recently happened over in Mexico and Latin America, and that is that these areas had just fought their revolutions to get their freedom from Spain. And in doing that, the King of Spain had never really allowed the people of Spain to establish an art school here, because this wasn't about making this area great, it was about benefiting Spain ultimately. So after Mexico had gotten its independence from Spain, they really wanted to demonstrate that they too had a cultural heritage of their own and could be on the artistic stage just as highly as Europe, not because of European artists painting in the Americas, but because of developing their own style. So what we're looking at is essentially something called patriotism through painting, all right? So they actually established a school of art, which was the Academy of San Carlos in Mexico. And they were really working to bring in artists from Europe who could not only train the artists who were here, but also encourage them to kind of create their own styles. So when this is happening, we're kind of looking at this interesting combination between the feelings of romanticism and the use of imagined landscapes as a way to invoke a feeling, and then the realism of obviously the realist movement. So what we see is Eugenio Landisio. And Eugenio, it's important to understand, is Italian. He comes over to Mexico and he gains great fame for being an excellent landscape artist and very, very good at mastering perspective through aerial and linear techniques. So he's a major influence in this school of San Carlos over here in the Americas. And he is going to assist some of these artists in establishing their own particular style using his landscapes. So the artist we're going to look at for this is Jose Maria Velasco, who Velasco is a Mexican artist. He's not European. He is Mexican, native Mexican. And he found great inspiration in painting realistic views that he saw because he actually lived on one of these hillsides of the Valley of Mexico and overlooking Lake Texaco right here, which Lake Texaco, as we've talked about in other pieces, was where the Aztecs actually founded their city of Tenochtitlan, and finding that eagle sitting on a cactus with a snake in its mouth. So Lake Texaco was a very important part of Aztec culture, as were the two mountains that you see in the background. There was a story about these two mountains being ill-fated lovers and kind of, never being able to truly be together. So this landscape was such a huge part of Aztec culture, and Velasco is going to paint this in a romanticist way because there is an agenda and there is emotion and feeling behind it. But he also paints it in his landscape that he does in trying to create that sublime feeling of romanticism. He also is very realistic because he paints it as it is. It's not an imagined or idealized place. It's realistic. This is what he would have seen all the time. So the work of art, all right, that we're going to look at is the Valley of Mexico for the 250, all right? And you can see here, all right, so this is actually, they changed it. This isn't the one for the 250 anymore. But you can see here, this is one of his views of the Valley of Mexico. So sitting down in these mountains. So he's just getting the same scene from a different angle. And you can see here that there is the Basilica of the Virgin of Guadalupe, which we talked about with the Virgin of Guadalupe, that was built over an Aztec temple honoring their flower goddess. And you can also see, yes, this is a modern Mexico and it is a post-Spanish Mexico, but the landscape pays honor to the heritage of the Aztec Mexico. And it's realistic, like he's painting something that you would actually see, but he has almost that romanticist agenda to it. So Velasco, we can't decide if he either rejected realism and romanticism or he embraced them both. But either way, he creates what I call realistic romanticism. because he paints with a romantic agenda of having feelings and painting what he's feeling in tribute of the Aztec heritage, but also in a realistic way, that he's actually painting what he saw right in front of him at that time, instead of painting it how it would have looked when the Aztecs were there. He didn't show the Spanish coming in and conquering it or burning it or whatever. He's showing it as it actually was now. And it was a great source of pride that Mexico was thriving now, but there were still major elements of its past. They couldn't forget that as well. So it also was showing, by him actually creating these works of art, that Mexico was growing. They had their own artists, their own styles, and their own techniques. And he would often put very small people, usually in the foreground, like right close to the viewer in his paintings. And they would often be in native dress to kind of show that the people are part of the landscape and they kind of represent the past and the future. And what's kind of cool is in the World's Fairs that are going to start to show up during this time, Velasco's works were displayed at the World's Fairs as this vision of what Mexico was. So the one for the 250 is the Valley of Mexico from the hillside of Santa Isabel. All right. So this is the one for the 250 that you can see right here. And again, you can see that it is a realistic place. He's painting from outside where he would have stood. You can see the two Aztec volcanoes in the background. You can see Lake Texaco. You can see the two people here in the front, the young and the old. So it's kind of like the youth of New Mexico and the ancient past of Mexico. They are part of the landscape. The people are part of this. So it's a little bit of a Bruegel, actually, with the peoplescapes. And he uses perspective to show how far-reaching this is. But you can also see that, yes, there is Mexico City, but Lake Texaco is receding. So like the past is receding, but it's still there. There's still the mountains. There's still the location. There's still the people who are the heritage of this. So it is the growth of Mexico as this proud nation, but also remembering the past that was there, which is very romanticist. All right, so now we're going to finish up with realist sculpture, all right? And the person that we're going to talk about is real easy to remember because we start with the R, and that is Rodin. Rodin changed everything in sculpture. Prior to Rodin, sculpture was stuck in the past. It was still very neoclassical. It's almost like Romanticism had kind of skipped it. Like they just couldn't, for some reason, move on from showing Romanticist sculpture, or excuse me, sculpture without that classical past to it. So prior to this time, 19th century sculpture was really only used for like public monuments. So kind of like Washington that Houdin did. But Rodin wanted to move on from that. Like he wanted to show sculpture that was realistic, of real things and real people and real emotions. And at that point, the French Royal Academy was still saying that in order for something to be a sculpture, it still had to be honoring something from the past, because stone is valuable. And if we're going to use it, it needs to be a valuable subject, like somebody from the past, like George Washington or Napoleon or something like that. But Rodin didn't believe that. He's like, no, it's about showing the realism of emotion and feeling and how things actually are. So these are just a couple of pieces by Rodin where you can see he's not sculpting here anything classical or impressive or biblical. He's sculpting somebody's hands. He's sculpting somebody stretching. And in ways that not only was the content realism, but the form was extremely natural. So you can see here a couple other Rodin sculptures. Like he just changed it up completely. Like it wasn't, this one at the bottom is not Greek gods or goddesses. That's real people embracing right there. So just a couple others by Rodin. I'm a huge fan of Rodin, so sorry. We have a couple at the History Museum in St. Louis, and I could stare at Rodin's work all day long. And I just have to laugh at this one, sorry. Okay. So in 1884 in France, there was a contest because artists were asked to create a sculpture to commemorate an event in French history that they were very, very proud of. And in this story, it takes place during the 100 Years' War. All right, so that's a war that didn't last 100 years. It actually lasted longer than that, but the course of the fighting between starting and stopping lasted about 100 years grand total. So there was an event during this war because it was between Britain and France, because Britain believed that they had rights to rule part of France by ancient heritage because of William the Conqueror, who was from France, coming over and becoming King of England. So during one part of this war, Calais, which is a very important city to France and to Britain, the British had seized Calais. They had surrounded it for a year and blockaded it, and people inside France were starving because of this. So at one point, there were 6 burghers who were leading citizens of Calais. So these are like high ups in the city, volunteered on their own that if they gave themselves up, would Britain, with the keys of the city, they're like, we will send ourselves out with the keys of the city. Would you stop the siege and let go of Calais? And the people would be spared. So King Edward III of England said, yes, that's fine, but I want them brought out in ropes around their necks. I want them barefoot. I want them bareheaded, and I want them sent out in utter humiliation with the keys in their hand. And when they did come out, Edward III ordered that they were going to be executed, which that's what they knew was going to happen to them. What they didn't know is that King Edward's wife, which you see here in the picture, would throw herself at the mercy of her king and beg for these men to be spared, but only after they had been starved and tortured and had to go through the waiting of knowing their execution was coming. So this is how previously this scene had been kind of shown, very much in a classical way. You can see they look like Roman soldiers. There's togas. The men here are shown barefoot, but they're still in nice clothing, and they're there making their sacrifice. But this is how Rodin decided to show it. And people could not believe that this is the way he chose to have this done. And it was originally done in marble, and then they had it recast in bronze. And there are several copies of this. The leader of this, the main leader in charge, is the man in the middle with the beard, which kind of distinguishes him. And then one of the men off to the side is holding the giant key to the city. They are barefoot, they are in tattered rags, and every single one of them, none of them are really looking much at each other, but every single one of them has a different expression on their face, realizing the fate that is coming before them. They're emaciated. They do not look heroic at all. They look like what they've been through is absolute hell. Some of them are resigned to the fact that they're going to die. Some of them are screaming in agony at the choice that they've made. Some of them are pondering what's about to happen to them. So it is a group, but at the same time, every single one of them is individual. And he decided to capture this in a monumental size, elevated, not at all. He's like, I don't want this up on a pedestal because that's not what they wanted. I want this at lower level where people can see it and engage in it and see just how great the sacrifice of these men was. Not because it was, the right thing to do, but because it was hard. This was a very tough thing, and it makes that scene look so much more heroic in the way that he showed it. So again, these were called the Burgers of Calais, and the burghers were the men who decided to go outside barefoot, chained, the ropes around their neck, in tattered rags. You can see that he made the clothes fit very loose on them because they would have been starving to death. And it's very real. That's what he wanted. Yes, it's romantic in that he's doing something from the past, but I don't necessarily think that he had any personal emotion in this. He was doing it for a job, so he's not really sculpting how he feels. He's sculpting how realistically they would have felt. And the people of Calais were originally like, this is not enough. You're not glorifying what they did. They're not heroes. And he's like, yes, they are, because you can see just how hard this was for them to do. So this monument, like you can really see here just how much they're suffering, the looks on their faces. I mean, it was meant to be very, very public, all right, with true meaning, right? And we do this because that's what, after the French Revolution, art was supposed to be for. It's not supposed to be just for the wealthy or just for the royalty. It's for public to teach lessons and for them to judge and learn from seeing it at the same time. So now we're going to stop with realism, and next we will be moving on to Impressionism, where it's no longer really going to be about content. It's going to be how a work of art is made that makes it art instead.